If you'd like to support our efforts, go to patreon.com/Omaha and consider becoming a patron for a few dollars a month.
Welcome to the North Omaha History Podcast with noted author and historian Adam Fletcher Sasse. Each week, Adam takes you on a guided tour through Omaha's dynamic past.
In July of 1910, racial tension flared towards Omaha's African-American community after a tremendous upset victory by boxer Jack Johnson versus James Jeffries in Reno, Nevada. And what happened is a little hard to imagine, I suppose. But Adam, tell us more about this.
You know, to really get the picture of what was going on at that point, Steve, we have to look back on Omaha. In the 1890s, there was a lynching that happened with a guy named Joe Coe. I think you and I can cover that on a later date. But that lynching was setting a tone for race relations in Omaha. We had the notorious city boss, Tom Dennison, who was really in there stirring up the pot and keeping things moving the way that he wanted to. Tom Dennison was he's called a political boss, but he was really kind of the crime boss too. The man had his finger on the pulse of everything illegal moving in Omaha. In 1910, he was right in the middle of it. And I'm going to tell you right now, not a lot of people connect Dennison to the Jack Johnson riot, but it's kind of obvious when you start to look at it. So Jack Johnson, world-famous boxer, he's the world's heavyweight champ, and he is just kicking butt left and right in every corner. 1910, he's at the top of his fight, and he's really just in great form. All of the boxing promoters love him, but with this kind of racist undertone that's sweeping around America at that point, it's kind of familiar to what's going on today. You know, lots of promoters were trying to find the white guy who would beat up the black Jack Johnson. And so they would look for all kinds of competitors and all kinds of rings. And they ended up coming across Jeffries. Jeffries took a fight, and he thought it was going to be a good deal. They staged the fight in Reno, and it's a hot summer, and everything's going on. Back then, the fight announcement wouldn't happen on the day of who won, wouldn't happen on the day that it happened, that the fight happened. Instead, it had to be passed around the nation on newsreels. And that was the way that it happened. But not even the movie newsreels like we imagine right away. Instead, it was a ticker tape newsreel. And these ticker tape newsreels always took a day to get into print, and they always took a day for news to travel anywhere. So the fight happens, and then the next day, the ticker tape comes through that says, hey, Johnson won, and Jeffries lost. And the implication in the newsreel at that point was that black people are still the champions of boxing, ergo, they are going to scare all white people and do bad things across the country. Of course, that's complete bullcookie. But what we know now is that Tom Dennison, in his management of Omaha's crime circles, was probably pressing the button. And one button that he pressed was, oh no, it's kind of a henny-penny approach to race relations. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. African Americans have won the world heavyweight boxing champion yet again. And in Omaha, what that translated to was a riot.
And I understand that there were mobs of white folks roaming throughout North Omaha, targeting blacks and their homes and stuff. Tell me more about that, Adam.
So Omaha had this notorious, it was basically a sin street, as it were. It was one street where the prostitutes hung out, where the opium dens were, where the gambling happened illegally, where illegal booze, just everything. It was the notorious area. Some folks called it the sporting district. It was along Douglas Street, and man, it was shady stuff. My friend Ryan Roenfeld just put out a new book that's all about Wicked Omaha, and I would definitely recommend that to folks. And it covers this shady street. But anyhow, so the sporting district had all this stuff going on. They got the ticker tapes first when they came through. And you had just picture packed bars and full bookies, bookie rooms that were just packed with people. And this tape comes through, and somebody says, surely they throw in some racial epithets, and and just nastiness. And they said, hey, let's go get them. So they turned north, and just mobs of white people. The World Herald talks about thousands. The Omaha Bee mentioned hundreds. And these folks took up bats, they took up guns, they took up whatever they could, and they headed north into the near north side, which was at that point around Cummings Street. And they terrorized the people who lived there. They smashed windows in houses. They burned outbuildings. They beat up people who were walking down the street. And one guy actually was murdered by a mob. Unfortunately, the newspaper doesn't list his name, so I can't give him justice by talking about him specifically. But it was a terrorizing time to be black in Omaha. And I think that it led to other things that happened in the future.
You know, when I think of the riots, I don't think of the turn of the last century. But, you know, as you mentioned, a little kind of foretold some things that were going to happen in the future. If you mention the North Omaha riots to me from the 60s, I always kind of think that it happened somewhere around the time of Martin Luther King being assassinated. But that's not the case. There were riots in 1966, 68, and 69. Talk about, briefly those riots to wrap up our discussion of Jack Johnson, because it all seems kind of interrelated.
Well, and I think that we can actually do an episode on that in the future, but to kind of hint at it, let's put the whole thing into context. 1891, I'd mentioned this early on, a guy called Joe Coe, he was also called George Smith. He was an African-American worker who lived in Omaha. He was accused of raping a child in North Omaha, and taken to jail. A mob shows up of over 1,000 people. They show up at the Douglas County Jail, which was right next to the courthouse, and they pulled him out of the courthouse. 12 city police officers stood by. They didn't do anything about it. They lynched Joe Coe right there. They lynched George Smith right there. And that was the first recorded race lynching that we have in Omaha. The Jack Johnson riots happened in 1910. They set up what happened just 9 years later in 1919. They talk about the Red Summer. The Red Summer is when a man was lynched in Omaha, again on a false accusation of raping a woman. This guy's name was Will Brown, and Will Brown again was a black man living in North Omaha, and he was accused of raping a white woman. They took him to jail. The mob shows up, but this time instead of 1,000 people, they record actually 20,000 people gathering in downtown Omaha around the courthouse that's there right now, the Douglas County Courthouse. The mob almost destroys the courthouse trying to get at Will Brown. The mayor doesn't want to turn him over, gets out on the steps, gives a speech. They almost lynched the mayor. They put the rope around his neck, and in the final moments, right after he was strung up, he was cut down. But that didn't happen for Will Brown. Instead, they lynched him. They burnt his body. They dragged him through the street. They sold body parts and rope parts to people to celebrate the lynching the next day. So this horrible thing was set up early on in Omaha. And then, just like you're saying, we could fast forward all the way into the 1960s and talk about the North Omaha riots. But before we get there, we would be remiss if we ignored all the other stuff that happened. I researched and wrote a long article on Wikipedia that's all about it's a timeline of civil unrest and riots in Omaha, and you can look it up that way on Google. Timeline of civil unrest and riots in Omaha. And basically, I found more than 24 riot events in Omaha's history, not all around race. A lot were around labor and issues like that, but they also involved ethnicity and a couple different elements. And just the city has been rocked by violence again and again. And so when people talk about the North Omaha riots, all that they're doing is mentioning the very most recent ones. And when they say that African Americans bring this on themselves, they're ignoring the role of white people in all of this. Because honestly, Steve, it's been a mess in Omaha for at least 150 years. a mess of riots and violence and systematic racism, all kinds of classism, just different elements that have definitely lit the city up. What the Jack Johnson riot really showed are some plain racial dynamics at work. But behind that, there was money. There was a political racket, a criminal syndicate that was run by Tom Dennison. And there was a whole culture of acceptance for violence, bringing us all the way up to 1966, which was the first riot in North Omaha on 24th Street, when a young African-American man was shot by a policeman without any justice for that young man. He was in the middle of robbing a store when he was shot. However, his back was to the policeman, he was unarmed, and he died. So that was 1966. In 1967, there was another riot in North Omaha that began on 24th Street, but it swarmed all the way around the community. Lots of people who live in Omaha today, and even some who might be listening to this podcast will probably remember all the violence that happened. People smashing windows up and down 16th Street, up and down 20th Street, up and down, or Florence Boulevard, up and down 24th Street on 30th, all the way up to Ames, all the way down to Cumming Street. And a lot of violence. But what they don't remember, what they don't know, or what they don't see is that police were involved in beating African Americans unfairly. Police violence in the 1960s was as hot of an issue, if not hotter, than what it is right now. Black lives have always mattered. And there is a long pattern of police abuse against African Americans in Omaha. And that's what we saw in 67. In 69, there was riots following the death of Martin Luther King. There were riots that happened for other reasons around the country. But in Omaha, a 14-year-old girl named Vivian Strong, 14 years old, Steve, she was playing with some friends in an empty apartment in the Logan Fontenelle Projects, Little Vietnam they were called, down at 24th and Paul Street. And these girls they had a record player. They were dancing. A cop shows up. A white cop and an African-American cop were called to come to the unit and clear it out. The white cop shows up, yells at the girls. They run out the back door into the alley. The white cop was there. He pulled his gun. He shot 14-year-old Vivian Strong in the back, and she died. This cop murdered this girl. And the raging riot that happened after that didn't end for days. They had to call in the Nebraska National Guard to end it. And the rage is still felt in the community right now. There are people who remember this. Vivian Strong's own sister is out in America today remembering this story because she was there. And it's just like, man, this pattern has got to stop. And the only way that we can stop it is by acknowledging where it came from and where it's going. And what's ahead could be as scary, if not worse, than what's ever happened before. But it begins by acknowledging things like the Jack Johnson riot and what happened before and around that time as well.
And thanks for putting that perspective on it, Adam. And if you'd like to support our efforts with this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/Omaha and consider becoming a patron for a few dollars a month. And Adam's got a great selection of books on Amazon, and his blog is northomahahistory.com. Adam, thanks.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the North Omaha History Podcast with noted author and historian Adam Fletcher Sasse. Join us next week as Adam takes you on another guided tour through Omaha's dynamic past.